They came along the dirt road just after the cicadas found their voice, that hour when the heat presses down like a big hand and everything sticky settles into quiet. The first car was white and square, with a roof rack stacked with metal poles and something wrapped in canvas. Behind it trundled a dusty truck with boards on the sides and a tarpaulin that flapped like a tired flag. The old men at the cafe set down their glasses all at once, and I watched their heads turn from the shade, as if you could hear surprise, that dry click in the throat before someone says, "Look there." Our village sits where the hills fold into each other north of Thessaloniki, on the way to the river valley where the soil is the color of cinnamon and, when you scratch with your toe, bits of stone catch the light like fish scales. They call the ravine behind our house Rain Ravine because it always floods first. In summer it holds only a thin trickle, the water moving slowly between rocks with soft edges, and kids like me hop from one to the next, collecting smooth pebbles and the hollowed pieces of clay pipes that wash out from somewhere up the bend. My father says the land around here is full of bones. It is true, but before that day bones meant goat ribs left by stray dogs, not the kind of bones people label in little drawers. My name is Marios. I was 12 that summer, tall enough to change the wicks on the lamps without dragging a chair under them, and heavy enough to run fast downhill and not bounce when I skidded into the fig trees. I always kept a slingshot tucked into my waistband and 2 marbles in the pocket of my shorts that knocked together when I took the steps 2 at a time. It is funny to remember the weight of those marbles even now. They felt like the start of everything important in my days. The white car parked next to our family's old truck, which leaned to one side because my father had never tied down the spare tire properly and it sat like a fat uncle behind the cab. Men and women climbed out, one in a broad hat with a string under his chin, another with a pair of sunglasses so big they looked like a beetle had landed on her face. The driver wandered into the shade, and my father stood, his chair scraping the cobbles, his mouth slightly open, as if he expected a greeting to float into it. "Calimera," said the woman with the sunglasses, but in that careful Greek that foreigners use, like they are placing cups on a shelf and are afraid of chipping them. We wrote to the council. "We are the team from the university." "Which university?" my father wanted to ask. "There is the university in Thessaloniki, where my cousin is a porter and steals chalk, and there are the universities abroad, which in our village we speak of like cities in the sky." "From Thessaloniki," she said, and then, "and from Paris," like this was one place and not two, as if the letter between them had long hands and could hold both. The men at the cafe muttered. Everyone loves to know something before everyone else. A few days earlier, a letter had arrived with a stamp showing a triangle in blue with stars. With a stamp like that, you forgot to wipe your hands on your shirt before you touched it, as if the ink might rub off. The headman, who keeps the key to the hall on a nail behind the calendar with the saints, had opened it carefully with a knife my father uses to peel apples. Then he had read aloud about permissions, and the ravines, and collections, and cooperation. He pushed the letter onto the table afterwards, like a pastry he didn't want to finish. Now, the foreigners were here in our square, in shoes with thick soles that made no noise on the stone. They shook hands without squeezing, as if they were trying not to offend our bones. One woman, Greek and younger, perhaps 30, with dark hair braided and doubled at the nape of her neck with pins, stepped away from the shade and bent to show me her hands. She held them out like a magician. Her palms were rough, and her fingers had a yellowish crust under the nails that was not dirt. "Paraloid," she said when I stared. "Special glue." "For bones." "For bones," I repeated, because how could a glue for bones be different from a glue for everything else? She laughed lightly in her throat and clapped her palms once, and dust rose between them like breath in winter. They set up in rain ravine, where in spring there are slippery weeds the goats won't touch and, in summer, brittle thistles that find your socks and kiss your ankles with their spines. They marked out squares with twine, tied to iron stakes with yellow tape. They hung a line level from the string and squinted at the bubble as if it were the moon. The man with the hat was named Georges, which he said sounds like a frog croaking when you do it right, and the beetle glasses woman was Anna. The Greek woman with the braids was Maria, and she asked if I would like to help carry water, passing me a tin canister with a lid that snapped shut, the kind we use for milk. Slow, she said. Please. No bumping. I carried that water like it held our summer in it, my knees bent, my free hand hovering just under the canister to catch it if it slipped, as if I could catch water ever. My mother shouted across the yard as I went, "Watch where you step, Marios," and I pretended I could not hear her. I saw those people dig and brush, with little tools that I had only seen at the dentist. They moved like they were peeling skin from an onion, slow and careful, and then stopping to write things down. Each time they stopped, Maria wrote in a notebook with a cover that had the texture of an orange peel, and she used a sharpened pencil she licked before the lead touched the page, which I had always been told never to do. "What are you looking for?" I asked, when she paused to drink. Her bottle was wrapped in wet cloth and it looked like a small swaddled baby resting beside her. "Bones," she said, swallowing. The cicadas hummed in our ears and made the air feel like syrup. Bones of animals that lived here long ago. Very long ago. Dinosaur? I asked, because that was the word I knew from picture books. My father had brought me one from a flea market in Thessaloniki, a heavy thing with pages the color of egg yolk and pictures of beasts with rainbow skin and eyes like the olives we pick in autumn. She smiled with her mouth and her eyes did something different at the same time. Younger than dinosaurs, older than people. Hipparian horses. Turtles. Giraffe-like animals. Maybe an ape. An ape? The word felt like a joke you weren't sure you should laugh at. We have jokes in our village about men up the hill whose arms are so long they can pick figs from the high branches without climbing, and about boys like me who hang from the pomegranate tree and make oh sounds to make the afternoons pass faster. But an ape, here, in our ravine? My mother would say we have enough monkeys sitting at the cafeteria every day, and my father would swat the back of my head and then wink. Maria must have seen something on my face because she added, "If we are lucky." Greeks found ape bones before, here in the north. 9 million years ago they lived near here. Late Miocene. She smiled again. Ouranopithecus. It is a big word. It means sky ape. A sky ape, I repeated, my mouth shaping the syllables like I was turning them over in my pocket next to my marbles. Ouranos is the sky, the clear one that boils like water in August and, at night, a bowl with a sprinkling of salt. I have seen old icons with angels that look like strong men with deep eyes and wings like curtains. I never imagined the sky full of apes. I snorted and then clapped a hand over my mouth before she could think I was making fun. She only laughed again and took her brush to the dirt like she was combing a goat kid. That night I told my father everything, because I cannot keep things inside my head. It is not a strength of mine, secrets itch like a mosquito bite to me and then I scratch and scratch until they are out on the table. My father listened while he trimmed a patch on his face where he had missed the last time he shaved. He uses a little mirror propped up on a nail next to the window, the glass speckled in one corner like an old man's eye. His razor has a handle with small cracks like roads map the hills. "Sky ape," he said, flashing his teeth in the mirror. Maybe it plays backgammon with God. Then he winked at me, his mustache bobbing slightly, and urged me toward the door to let the men in for coffee. Most nights in our village are alike, and when something different happens, it feels like you have stepped into the wrong house by mistake and see a chair sitting in the center where there should be a table. That night the old men at the cafe talked softer than usual. The sound was like moths beating their wings against lampshades. They say it is 9 million years old, said the headman. Said a man who always said that when his mind was full and his words were tired. They say a lot of things. Our priest came and sat near the door with his hat on his knees. Father Demetrius has fingers like olive roots, gnarled and strong. He drank his coffee in one swallow and sighed like he was letting go of a bag of flour from his shoulder. I liked him because he would come to the square even when he didn't have to, and listen, and sometimes he would laugh without worrying about who was watching. He is a man who does not believe that everything must be heavy. They dig, he said, shrugging. We pray. The world is large enough to hold both. Some of the men nodded. Others clicked their tongues against their teeth and said nothing. I dreamed of it that night, Ouranopithecus, wearing little boots and a blue hat, flying from one tree to another like a bird and scolding us for being loud. Dreams can be silly. The morning after, the books opened their pages and the pencils found sharpness in my fingers and the hours passed like beads on my mother's cambeloy. After school, I went back to the ravine. The team had strung a tarp for shade that snapped in the hot breath of noon. They had dug deeper where before there was the color of fresh bread crust, and now the dirt had a darker tone, like someone had spilled coffee and tried to wipe it away. The smell was different too, damp and a little like old stone. Georges with the hat had a small golden frame around something in the dirt. Regard, he said to Anna, and then said to Maria, look, because really you can say the same thing from two mouths. They were quiet, and their quiet told me to be quiet too. I stood on my toes and then dropped back to my heels because I remembered not to jostle the string. The thing in the ground was the color of baked beans and not very much bigger than my thumb, but it had edges that teeth have, and curves that bones have, if you have seen a small animal's head picked clean by ants. A piece of the world that belonged to something that once breathed lay in the dirt as if it had been waiting for a polite knock. Mandible, said Anna softly. The jaw. Molar crown. Thick. She turned to Maria and asked in Greek, you see. I saw nothing more than I had, but I nodded anyway, because I could feel the air leaning in with all of us to look. They took pictures, moving their bodies to cast soft shadows so the contours would be clear. They measured with little calipers and placed a paper scale next to the find. Late Miocene, Maria murmured again, as if she were coaxing a child to say its name. Ouranopithecus, Georges said, making it sing. The first newspaper to write about it was from Thessaloniki, a small article with a blurry picture where the bones looked like a coin someone had dropped in mud. The title was dramatic in a way that made my father cough with laughter behind his newspaper. Ancient ape in Macedonia might tell our story, it said, even though, when I asked Maria if it would, she pursed her lips. It tells a story, she said. Not all of ours, at least not alone. Thick enamel, strong jaw. The teeth say this ape was eating hard things, maybe roots, maybe tough fruits. The valley must have been more open then, drier. There are many branches in the family tree of apes, Marios. Many cousins. Not everything is a grandfather. I liked her for saying it like that. She didn't move the world closer to us to make us feel special. She let the world stay big. I felt a shiver of pride anyway that something so old had sat in our ground all this time, under my feet, under my stories, and only now we were meeting it. I told my grandmother that night, and she said bones are bones whether they belong to princes or dogs and that you must respect them. Then she told me a story of a giant who slept under the hills near Pikerme and rolled over when the wind blew from the south. But that is another place, she said, tapping my forehead with a knuckle. Our giants live here. She poked my brother's belly then and he squealed. School smelled like chalk and sweat and the onion our teacher ate on bread in the break behind the cloakroom door. When we wrote dictation, I would watch the dust floating in that beam of light that never moved, even though the sun did. That week, our teacher had us write essays about important things in the world. We could choose the subject, which meant we lined up our world like a cart and took the thing that was brightest and rolled it into place. I wrote at the top of my page, in letters that leaned all the same way then flattened at the end, Ouranopithecus in evolution, fact or fossil fantasy. I thought that would make my teacher laugh, because I had heard him say on another day, newspapers chase fantasies. Real facts are quiet. He read the title with one eyebrow like a question and then sat back and said, "Write. Write what you see." I wrote what I saw. I wrote about the dust and the string lines and the way those people knelt and spoke the same thing in two languages, and how that was like when we say the prayer with my grandmother and sometimes she whispers the old words and sometimes she says the new ones because her tongue is quicker, and how both reach up the same way. I wrote that the bone was small and the world was big, and how calling it ours made me proud even if it didn't mean what some were saying. I wrote that fantasy felt to me like a donkey with wings in a picture book and the bone was not that. The bone was heavy on the end of the small trowel when Maria lifted it, and it made everyone breathe and stop talking. I wrote that as my father says, your hands know truths your mouth does not. I finished with a flourish of my pencil and felt pleased with myself, because sometimes language sits in your mouth like this, like bread with olive oil and salt that tastes twice as good because you are hungry. Then Stavros, who sits in front of me and has ears that stick out like handles on a jug, turned around and made a monkey face and whispered, "Oh, our boy is in love with the apes." I didn't punch him, though my fist itched. My brother would have punched him, and then there would have been a meeting with our parents and the teacher would scratch his head and say he should have known. I just said to Stavros, better than being in love with my own reflection, and he flashed his teeth and said, you have to love something, no. Then he flicked the curl of eraser dust from my desk onto the floor like that settled everything. The day the earth moved, the morning was soft, the kind of air that makes flies lazy and dogs sleep in puddles of shade and let their tongues droop like old shoelaces. We had rice with tomato and feta for lunch. My mother set the pot on the table with a towel wrapped around it and said to my father, be careful, and he lifted the lid anyway and the steam kissed his face. I used my fork to make a little hill of rice on my plate and then a trench, and my mother clucked her tongue and knocked my knuckles lightly with the back of her spoon because she pretends I am for some time still. When it came, at first it was like a big truck rumbling over stones just outside the window, the way the quarry truck makes the glasses chink on the shelf. Then it kept going. The table made a noise that was not normal, a low, slow groan, the wood talking, and the wall behind me creaked like a ship turning in water. Outside, said my father, softly and then louder. Outside. He put his hand on my shoulder as if he were guiding me through a crowd, and we moved, and we were outside, the sky bright and stupidly blue, and the whole village was breathing like a chest. The square stones shifted just enough that you could see them forget the way they had always sat. The long iron on the top of the well squealed, and then it stopped, and a cup someone had left on the edge rolled to the ground and broke, and that sound is always more shocking than it should be. The earth stilled, like a goat that had thought to leap and then changed its mind. We slept outside that night. Everyone did. We dragged blankets to the olive trees and made little camps, our voices suddenly careful, like we were in a church that had no walls, and we were worried the trees would be offended by loudness. The scientists came up from the ravine when the shaking started and stood in our square with their mouths open a little. Georges held his hat in his hand like a child holds a toy that has fallen in the dirt. Our squares, Anna said to no one, to herself, to the dirt. Our lines. She laughed a short laugh and then put both hands over her mouth and shook her head at herself, because at moments like that people remember what matters and then forget and then remember again. I heard my father tell her quietly, if your bone is truly 9 million years old, it can wait for morning. She nodded, and when she turned the corner with Maria, I saw her hand resting on Maria's shoulder like a bird that had decided to trust. The next day the sun rose with the same indifference it always has, and we checked the ravine. The strings were sagging, and one of the stakes had slipped, but the earth around the square where they had found the jaw had not cracked. They had not yet lifted the piece. It still rested in its plaster jacket, a white shell around the small dark things it protected, like the inside of a fresh feta, creamy and fragile. Maria looked at it and exhaled through her nose like a small horse. Good, she said. We will carry it up today. The men carried the crate like a casket, and I walked behind, my hands held out though there was nothing to catch. We set it on the table in the school in a room that smelled like erasers and rain, and the scientists hovered, and I felt like I should take off my shoes. People came to see it. They shuffled into the classroom, hats in hands, and peered, and someone always asked if it was human and someone always said, no, before the scientists could answer, because we like to be the ones to say no here. Our priest came and stood with his hands behind his back like a sailor at attention. We are grateful to see so far back, he said in his gentle voice. It makes the now more interesting. He looked at me when he said this, and I felt seen like when my mother adds a piece of fried cheese to my plate when no one is looking. Later that day, a man who spends every afternoon at the cafe with cigarette ash trailing onto his trousers like a comet said loudly that foreigners come here to take our bones and then tell lies about us, and my father said not at all loudly, and without thumping his chest, they have shared every step with us, and that was that. At the end of the week, Maria said they would give a talk in the hall. They hung a white sheet on the wall and set up a projector that clicked and sighed. They used a generator for the electricity because power still came and went like a cat with its own mind. The first picture was of the ravine, and the men and women smiled to see it there, because when you see a picture of your own home, it is as if someone has praised you in a way that is not embarrassing. Then there were photographs of the bones, each one labeled with numbers and letters that looked like code, and Anna explained, in Greek, so clearly that even the old men kept themselves from nodding off. The molar crowns were thick, she said. She traced with her finger the shape of the cusp as if it were a hill she had climbed. The face would have been robust. The enamel thick, to chew hard foods. She showed drawings of branches, a simple tree, and said some people think this animal is closer to our cousins the great apes, perhaps closer to the line that led to gorillas, perhaps a cousin of a thing that looked at the world with eyes that had never seen a person. Whatever it is, it lived here when the climate was different and the valley was open, with grasses, and trees spaced so you could run between the shadows. Is it our ancestor? Called someone, because how can you not ask? Maria measured her breath and said, we don't know. We think maybe not. We think it is a nearby branch. But it is ours in that it is from our earth, and it belongs to everyone because knowledge belongs to everyone. That felt good to hear. The hall was hot. People fanned themselves with old programs from weddings and one with a picture of caramellies that had little circles from grease on the back. The priest dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief and smiled at his shoes. At the end, the room was quiet for a moment as if we had all swallowed something that needed time to settle, and then the sound came up like water boiling, applause from hands that have held heavy things their whole lives. It was late when we came out. The walkway to the hall is lined with bitter orange trees that drop their fruit like lanterns. I could smell the perfume from the blooms and the bitter smell from the split skins. The stars were bristling overhead, and somewhere a dog barked as if announcing the end of one thing and the start of another. Maria walked next to me, her shoes clicking softly on the stones, and I asked, "What will happen to the jaw?" She said, "It will go to the museum in Thessaloniki first. Then perhaps Athens. We will study it for a long time. We will print papers." She smiled at the sound of that word. "We will argue. That is the way." The next day I took the bus with my cousin into Thessaloniki to deliver eggs to a cousin of my mother's and to stand under the White Tower and feel small. The bus smells like warm vinyl and diesel and hair, because hair is always there. The city felt the earthquake worse than we did in the hills. Cracks like lightning ran down old buildings, plaster lay piled like shed skin along the curb, and the voices of people carried a new edge, the way a knife sounds different after it is sharpened. Still, the sea was as it always is, patient like a friend, and the gulls drifted with the air. In the museum, the rooms were cool in that careful way of museums, and the women at the desks looked at our shoes and let us pass. In one hall, skeletons stood like large, bony questions, a mastodon with tusks like the handles on a giant's chest, horses with 3 toes, deer with antlers like woven baskets. I stood under the big jaw of a creature with teeth like loaves of bread and imagined the small jaw from our ravine sitting in a laboratory under bright light, and my chest thumped in a way that has nothing to do with fear. It is a hunger. At night, after dinner, after dishes, after the yellow rectangle of our window blinked out one room at a time, I lay on the roof and watched the satellite crawl across the sky like a silver ant. The roof still carried the day's heat, and it pressed into my back. I breathed in the smell of the tar, of our neighbor's jasmine, of the goat from 2 houses down. The more you lie still, the more you can hear. A moth bumping against a lampshade somewhere. The small cough of the old man down the lane. Farther, the river, maybe, talking to itself. When I closed my eyes, I saw the jaw, and the strings, and Maria's hands, and I thought about the word evolution, which is big like the sky and full of points of light and emptiness. If I had been older, I might have been embarrassed to think as hard as I was thinking. I was 12. Embarrassment still had distance. Our teacher read my essay a few days later, aloud, after the geography lesson where we traced the coastline with our fingers, and he told us every bay has stories of ships that went out and ships that came back, and that those 2 numbers never match. When he said my title, some of the boys laughed, and then they stopped. He read in his calm voice, and at the part where I wrote that calling something fantasy when you do not understand it is like saying a shadow is a ghost without turning on a light, he paused, and then he looked at me, and something like a soft nod passed between us. He set the paper down at the end and told the class that good writing does not put an arm around your neck and shout, it puts a hand on your shoulder and waits. I felt my ears grow warm. Life went on. It always does, even when something inside you has shifted like a stone that finds a new home in the wall. The team kept working. They found more pieces, bits of molar, a fragment of zygomatic bone, a part of palate that looked like a small bridge. Each find came with the same quiet and the same careful touch, the brush that pulled dust as if dust had feelings. They showed us the way the roots of a tooth tell you about the stress of a bite, the way where on an edge tells you what rippled through a jaw every day when the animal lived. And they told us the things they did not know. I loved those moments best, more than the yes and more than the numbers. It takes a kind of bravery I admire to say in front of a group of people, "We are not sure." It is like standing on the bank of the river and admitting you do not know where the deepest channel is, yet stepping in anyway and measuring with your legs. One afternoon, Stavros and I went to the ravine with a rope. There is a tree near the bend that leans out over the drop. If you throw the rope over the branch, you can swing across the dry stream bed and let go and fly for a breath long enough to make your heart forget both before and after. As I swung and flopped into the dust and rolled, I saw a flash of white on the bank. I walked toward it and then stooped and then knelt. It was a stump of bone, small and blunt. I called Maria and she climbed the ragged bank like a cat, her sandals not slipping once. She looked and then smiled and put her hand near my shoulder and said, "Good eyes," and my chest grew taller by a finger. "Not an ape," she said, gently, because she knew what I was thinking, the way you know someone is about to tell a joke before they open their mouth. "But good." It was an antelope's foot bone, water washed so that it felt like a stone between my fingers. She let me keep it, because it was not exciting for their work and she knew to give something to the boy who had brought them water and listened with his mouth closed when he could have opened it. I put it next to my bed, on the crate where I keep my treasures, a shell with a hole in it, the metal cap from a bottle with an eagle on it, a coil of blue string, and a postcard that a man named Theo sent from Germany with a picture of a green field and a gray sky. Ouranopithecus. The word kept knocking in my head like a visitor who is neither friend nor stranger. It is a name, but it is also a question mark with a place to sit. Some days, I pictured a dark face with eyes like small ponds in the shade of plane trees, and a mouth that could find joy in a fruit. Other days it was only the jaw in the plaster, and the way the tooth sat squarely in its cradle with a patience that I find myself envying now. I asked my father if he thought we came from apes and he shrugged and said, "We come from each other. If you go back far enough, it is all one bread." He tore a piece and handed it to me and said, "What matters is how you treat the person next to you while you are here." That summer wore thin and then tore at the edges, and the wind in the evenings turned cooler in a way that made dogs curl tighter on their thresholds. The scientists packed boxes. They labeled everything carefully and taped them with a tape that screamed when you pulled it and stuck to your wrist hairs in an unforgiving way. They wrote thank you notes in their careful, slanted handwriting to the council and to my father and mother and to the school and to the priest. Maria pulled me aside and handed me a brown envelope. Inside was a photocopy of a page with a title at the top with big letters. Ouranopithecus macedonensis, it said, and under that a block of names. "This is from the first paper," she said. "It will be in a journal. You can keep this. Later there will be more." My fingers wanted to sweat through the paper and ruin it. I whispered thank you in a voice that came from further back in my throat than my words usually do. When the day came, they drove away waving from the windows like families leaving after a wedding, hands fluttering and faces pulled into smiles that are like the face you make when you get cold water on your ears in the bath. We watched until the white car and the truck turned and dust rose like a curtain and then settled. My grandmother said, "We will see them again," with the confidence of a person who knows that life is a circle and not a line, even when you think the road bends out and never back. I went down to the ravine and lay on my back on the dirt and looked up through the tangle of branches. In the slice of sky between leaves, a stork passed, its wings the color of the priest's robe on feast days. The world was busy and also very still. The school year started again. We lined up in the yard and said the prayer. The boys with new shoes scuffed them on purpose and then pretended to be sad. The girls wore dresses that flared when they spun, even though no one told them to spin. Our teacher wrote the date on the board and the chalk squeaked in the way that makes your teeth feel strange. "We begin," he said. We begin again. Later that day, he found me in the hall and told me he liked my essay and that he would keep it in his drawer to remind him that sometimes the right title opens the door. I walked home that day taller than I was the day before, which is a good way to be 12. Years later, they say that time makes clear what you cannot see when you are standing inside the moment. I think sometimes that is true and sometimes it is an excuse you make for not paying attention. I have come back to the ravine in my mind all these years whenever someone insists on a simple story with a beginning and an end and a straight line between them. Life, it turns out, is not that. You drink coffee with a priest and you move a fragile jaw with your heart in your mouth and then the earth moves and then it stops and then the people you love make jokes and then they say wise things without knowing and then you write words and sometimes they fit and sometimes they do not. And still the world opens up. When I was 12, I thought a lot about what was fact and what was fantasy because the newspaper headline used those words, and I wanted to get it right. I liked knowing a thing was solid because I had touched it. But I also learned that that fantasy is not always lying. Sometimes it is reaching the way your hand reaches in the dark for the switch you know is there, because someone might be afraid, and you are brave for a second and keep your hand out in front of you. I saw people build stories around that jaw to make themselves feel bigger, and I saw people make stories to make themselves feel smaller and safe. Neither is exactly right. The bone was a bone. The story is ours, woven with our breath. I can still hear the way Maria said the name. Ouranopithecus. The ape that looked up, or the ape under the sky. The name itself holds a lesson, if you like that sort, and I do. It tells me to keep my face turned towards something larger than myself without losing my footing on the path that runs through my yard and past the olive trees and down into the ravine where water will one day run again. I didn't know then that knowledge moves like the river under stones, sometimes loud, sometimes quiet, but always, and that it is a blessing to be a boy given permission to stand on the bank and listen. Now, when I pass the Cafaneo and the old men are still there, though they are different old men and their chairs creak and their hands are maps of their work, they call to me and I stop because to pass without stopping is to say you have forgotten who you are. We talk about the price of olives and the way the road to Thessaloniki is always being repaired and the fact that someone's goat found a hole in the fence that was made by a man with his head too full of other things. Sometimes one of them glances toward the ravine and says, "Remember when the foreign students came and took the bones away," and I say, "They did not take, they showed," and they grunt and nod and ask me if I will try their new batch of tsiporo. I taste it and say that it is very good as you must, and then I wipe my mouth and look up. If you stand on the hill above the ravine at dusk, the air changes in a way you feel before you notice. It goes from warm to the kind of cool that finds the place at the back of your neck where your hairline ends. The noises change too. The buzzing drops down. The crickets find their evening rhythm. A distant car becomes a thread that pulls through the fabric of the valley and then is gone. The light moves across the stones and makes old surfaces new. It is in those moments that I hear again the careful swish of a brush on dirt, and the hush of people holding their breath. I feel again the first time I saw the dark curve of a tooth and understood that this place where we walk and laugh and quarrel and kiss friends on the cheeks when we see them in the square, this place is a layer of a layer of a layer, and under it all something waited and waits still. That is not fantasy. That is the most practical truth I know. I think of it when the ground shakes again, as it has other times since short breath, long breath, air trembling, and I hold my mother's arm and we go outside and stand under the sky and listen. I think of it when my own son brings me a small bone from a bank in another ravine and holds it in his palm with reverence and impatient joy, and I see myself in him so clearly that I have to turn away for a moment. We will ask at the museum, I tell him, because to give something the right name is a kind of love. He asks me whether the sky apes might be watching us, and I tell him that in some way I cannot peel open. Everything we have been was watching us then and watches us now through our own eyes. That summer gave me a shape for wondering. It made me see that people who kneel carefully and people who argue gently and people who admit they do not know are the ones who do not make the world smaller to feel big. It taught me that faith and curiosity are not enemies any more than rain and soil are enemies. It taught me a new way to love where I was born, not because a thing that might be close to us lay under our feet, but because the layers of time here are like layers in a cake that someone has cut and shown to you, and you see the stripes and you think, of course, how beautiful, and then you take a bite and it is sweet. And there is enough for everyone. And if you are careful and lucky, there will be enough after you are gone. I still have the photocopy Maria gave me. The edges are frayed now from being taken out and put back, and the black type is a little fuzzy in places, and the paper smells the way old paper smells, like dust and the inside of a thyme bush rubbed between fingers. On the back, in her handwriting, which is small and strong, she wrote, "For Marios, who carried water and questions." Sometimes I read it aloud when the house is empty and the sound of my voice surprises me as much as the boy he still contains. When I do, my wife shakes her head and smiles the way you smile when you catch someone dancing alone in a kitchen. I tell her, this is how a boy remembers a summer, and she says, this is how a man tells one. It is a good life to have in a place where the wind carries dust with stories in it, and where the trees lean into each other as if sharing gossip, and where the river keeps its counsel but shows you enough to keep you honest. It is good to know that a jaw the size of a spoon can make you look up the way you did before you knew words like evolution and enamel and Miocene. It is good to write a title that is a question and then spend the rest of your life answering it with your days. Fact or fossil fantasy, I wrote when I was a boy who could swing from a rope and skim across a dry stream bed and land with dust in his mouth and laughter in his chest. I know now the bone was a fact and the fantasy was our hunger to see ourselves in everything. But there is another fantasy that serves us, if we keep it tender, and it is this, that the land remembers us kindly when we are gone. If that is a dream, then let it be. I will keep watching the sky, with both feet on the ground, the way the word teaches.